Tonight, the forests and stone circles of Caledonia, ancient Scotland, 83 AD. The Druids and the sacred groves of ancient Caledonia. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The sky above the Tay estuary is still dark. A thin line of grey sits along the eastern ridge, barely enough to separate the hills from the clouds above them. The river moves quietly below, wide and cold, carrying the smell of peat and wet stone down from the high ground to the north. Nothing stirs yet on the southern bank, where the Roman camp at Carpow will later stand. But in 83 AD, that ground is still forest edge, still Caledonian. The trees here are not the managed woodlands of later centuries. They are old growth. Sessile oak and Scots pine press close to the waterline. Alder roots grip the muddy banks. The canopy is dense enough that even in late summer, the forest floor holds the cold of the night well past first light. The ground underfoot is soft with decades of fallen needles and rotting leaf matter. It gives slightly with each step. To the north and west, the Grampian Massif rises in long, dark ridges. The Romans called this range the Mons Graupius, though the exact summit of that name remains uncertain. What is certain is the shape of the land. Broad straths open between the ridges. The rivers Erne, Almond, and Isla flow southward through those valleys, each one fed by smaller burns that drain the high moorland above. The water in every one of those burns is black in the dark before dawn and cold enough to ache. The air at this hour carries moisture. It is late summer, probably August or September, the season in which Gnaeus Julius Agricola led his Roman legions into this northern territory. But late summer in Caledonia is not warm. The nights drop close to the soil, and the mist settles into every hollow. The higher ground above Strathion is invisible now, wrapped entirely in low cloud. The smell is of wet heather and bracken, with underneath it the sharper note of pine resin released by the cooling night air. Somewhere to the northwest, above the valley of the Erne, the land flattens briefly onto a wide elevated shelf. This is the kind of ground where Pictish and pre-Pictish peoples had been raising structures for centuries before this morning. The stone circles of Perthshire are old, even in 83 AD. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, further north, are older still. The great ring at Tumnavery near Tarland in Aberdeenshire has stood for more than 2,000 years by the time Agricola's army moves through these territories. Its stones are low and heavy, set into a slight rise in the moorland. At this hour, they are invisible against the dark ground. The circle at Croft Morag, near Aberfeldy on the southern bank of the Tay, is closer to the valley floor. It is a compact site, 3 concentric arrangements of stone and post holes, the outermost ring made of large standing stones set in a low bank. The stones themselves are local. They came from the hillside behind them. They have not been moved far, but they have been shaped and placed with deliberate care. In the last of the darkness before dawn, they are just shapes in the grey. The largest stone faces roughly northeast toward the direction from which the light will come. The forests surrounding Croft Morag are not silent at this hour. A tawny owl calls once from the oaks above the river. A pine martin moves through the understory without troubling the leaf litter. Red squirrels are already beginning to move in the canopy. The rivers hold salmon in late summer, large fish pushing upstream against the current. They surface occasionally, a brief disturbance in the dark water, then gone. The people who live in this landscape in 83 AD are known to the Romans as the Caledonii. They are a loose grouping of tribes rather than a single people. Their settlements are scattered across the glens and river valleys, always near water, always with defensible ground nearby. The roundhouses of this period are substantial structures. A typical house in Strathion at this time has a diameter of perhaps 12 to 15 meters at the base. The walls are built from timber uprights set into the ground, with wattle panels between them packed with clay and animal hair. The roof is steeply pitched and thatched with heather or reed, depending on what is nearest to hand. Inside such a house at this hour before dawn, the central hearth still holds heat from the night before. The fire will not have gone entirely out. Someone will have banked it with turves of peat before sleeping. The smoke finds its way out through the thatch above, but some of it lingers inside, and the smell of peat smoke is constant, woven into every textile and every length of hair. The floor is beaten earth near the walls and flat stone slabs closer to the hearth. Dogs sleep near the warmth. The people sleeping in these houses wear wool. The sheep of this period in Scotland are small-framed animals, closer in type to the Soay sheep that still survive on Herta in the St Kilda archipelago than to any modern breed. Their fleece is fine and close, more brown than white in many animals. The wool is hand-spun on a drop spindle, then woven on a vertical warp-weighted loom. The cloth produced is dense and naturally water-resistant. A person working outside in early morning rain in this climate will stay warm in wet wool in a way that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with survival. Cloaks fastened at the shoulder with a single pin are the practical garment for outdoor work. The pins in use at this period in northern Britain are often cast in bronze. Some are decorated. A few are iron. The designs are restrained but deliberate, small curves and repeating patterns worked into the flat head of the pin. These objects are not ornaments in the modern sense. They serve a function, and they are made well because a thing made well lasts longer. The forest to the north of the Tay, stretching up into what is now Highland Perthshire, is older and less disturbed than the valley woodland. This is the great wood of Caledon that Roman writers described, though it was not one continuous forest, but a mosaic of dense woodland, open moorland, bog, and high bare ridge. The Scots pine here are ancient. Some individual trees standing in 83 AD may have been growing for 300 years or more. Their bark is deeply ridged and orange-red in the upper trunk. In daylight they are striking. In the dark before dawn, they are columns of black against a dark sky. The high ground between the Tay and the Dee, the massif that includes what is now Skehallion and Ben Lowers, is open above the tree line. The tree line in this period sits roughly at 400 meters in many parts of Perthshire, though it varies with aspect and with local burning. Above it, the ground is heather moorland, cotton grass bog, and exposed quartzite and schist. Schiehallion's quartzite summit cone would have been white in certain lights even then, distinctive from a great distance. People navigated by it. It sits at the center of a territory that multiple communities would have shared and known. The passes through this high ground are few, and they are remembered. The pass that follows the river Garry north through what is now the Druids corridor is the most direct route between the central Highlands and the far north. It is not a comfortable route. The ground on either side is high and exposed, and the wind funnels through it from the north with very little to break it. In August of 83 AD, it would still have been passable, but only just, and only to people who knew it well. It is in this landscape that Agricola's army is moving. The Romans have pushed north from their winter base at Inchtathil on the Tay. This great legionary fortress is still under construction in 83 AD. It sits on a raised terrace on the north bank of the Tay, near what is now the village of Capath in Perthshire. The fortress is designed to hold a full legion, roughly 5,000 men. The internal layout follows the standard Roman pattern. The Principia, the headquarters building, sits at the center. The granaries are large stone-built structures near the north gate, raised on pillar footings to allow air to circulate beneath the grain stores and keep them dry. The grain itself, mostly wheat, has been brought north in bulk. The Tay at Inchtathil is not the wide tidal estuary, it becomes lower down. Here it is a fast river running over gravel beds, perhaps 80 meters across at the summer level. It can be forded in places in August. The Roman surveyors chose this location carefully. The raised terrace gives clear sight lines across the river to the south and along the valley to east and west. A lookout on the rampart of the unfinished fortress can see several kilometers in good visibility. In the dark before dawn, visibility is perhaps 20 meters. East of Inchtathil, the valley of the Isla opens to the north. This is agricultural ground even in the 1st century. The lower slopes of Strathdal and Glenisla carry evidence of cultivation from this period. Small rectangular fields, cleared of the larger stones and bounded by low earthen banks, sit on the south-facing slopes where drainage is reasonable and the growing season long enough for barley. Barley is the primary grain crop of this part of Scotland at this time. Emmer wheat is also grown in some areas. The fields are small by any later standard, perhaps half a hectare each, worked with a simple ard, a scratch plough pulled by oxen or cattle. The cattle are important. In this economy, they are wealth made visible. A household's standing is partly measured in the number of cattle it holds over winter. Keeping cattle through a Scottish winter requires planning from early summer onward. Hay must be cut and stored. The animals will be brought close to the settlement in October. Some will be slaughtered before the cold deepens, the meat preserved by salting and smoking. The hides are cured and used. Nothing is wasted in a winter this far north. Salt is not easily obtained in Perthshire. It is a traded good, coming from coastal salt pans where seawater is evaporated in flat stone or clay troughs. The nearest coastal salt sources are to the east, on the shores of the Firth of Tay and further along the Angus coast. Salt moves inland through exchange networks that are informal but consistent. So does iron, smelted from bog ore at sites near the coast and in the lower glens, then worked by smiths in settlements further inland. A blacksmith in a glen settlement in 83 AD works with a small stone-built forge, a clay-lined bowl for the hearth, bellows made from animal hide, and a small collection of iron hammers and tongs. The tools produced are practical: blades, wedges, nails, cloak pins, harness fittings, nothing elaborate. The light is beginning to change. The grey along the eastern ridge above the Tay estuary is widening now, becoming less uniform. There is a slight warmth in the colour, still not enough to call it light, but different from the flat dark of an hour ago. The birds register this before any person would. A blackbird in the oak canopy along the river begins a single phrase, then stops. Another answers from somewhere further into the trees. The stone circles on the moorland above Aberfeldy catch this first change in the sky before anything at ground level does. The tallest stones at Croft Morag stand roughly 1.5 meters above the turf. They are not the great monoliths of Orkney or the massive trilithons of Wiltshire. They are regional in scale, made from the rock that was already there, dragged only short distances. But at this moment, as the sky begins to define itself against the stone, the circle has a presence that has nothing to do with its physical dimensions. The Aberdeenshire stone circles, the recumbent circles, are oriented differently. The recumbent stone, the large horizontal slab set between two tall flanking uprights, always faces roughly southwest to southeast, toward the arc of the moon at its highest southern point. The circle at Easter, Equahorthes near Inveruary, is one such site. The recumbent slab there is a large piece of red granite. The flanking stones are grey granite. The contrast is deliberate. Someone chose those stones for their colour. That choice was made more than 2,000 years before this morning, and the stones still hold it. The land around Easter Equahorthes is rolling agricultural ground, lower than the high moorland of Perthshire. The River Don runs several kilometres to the south. The soil here is lighter, better drained, easier to work with the simple tools available. Communities in this part of Aberdeenshire in the 1st century AD grow crops on the lower ground and graze cattle on the higher slopes. The roundhouses here are similar in construction to those of Strathion, though the building materials vary with what is locally available. Stone replaces some of the timber in wall construction, where the nearest forest is a long carry away. The dark is thinning now across the whole of this wide territory. From the Tay to the Don, from the coastal plain of Angus to the high passes of the Grampian Ridge, the land is emerging from the same night at the same pace. The peat bogs on the high plateau between Deeside and Donside are still invisible, black and flat under low cloud. The River Dee itself, running east from its source near the Cairngorm Plateau, is audible before it is visible this morning. The water moves fast over the granite of its upper reaches, a sound that carries. The grey comes slowly over the hills above the River Tay. It is late summer, 83 AD. The light is the colour of wet flint, and the air carries the smell of wet bracken and cold ash. In the round, houses scattered across the hillsides of what the Romans would later call Caledonia. People are beginning to stir before the light has properly arrived. The houses themselves are low and circular. The walls are built from upright timber posts, woven through with hazel rods and packed with a daub of clay and animal dung. The roofs are steep cones of dried reed thatch, cut from the margins of the nearby lochs. Each house is perhaps 9 or 10 meters across. Inside, a single central hearth holds the embers from the night before. The fire never goes fully out. It is too important to let it die. A woman crouches at the hearth and feeds in a twist of dried sedge and a handful of small birch twigs. The smoke rises and finds its way through a gap left in the thatch above. The walls inside are dark with years of soot, and the smell of old smoke is in everything, in the wool blankets, in the hair, in the packed earth floor. The people who sleep in these houses are the tribes the Romans call the Caledonii. They do not call themselves that. They belong to smaller groups, to kin networks tied to particular valleys and riversides. The man who rises first in one of these houses near the Erne Valley is perhaps 30 years old. He is stocky and broad through the shoulders, with reddish-brown hair worn loose to his collar. His skin is weathered from years of outdoor work. He sleeps in a woolen tunic that reaches to mid-thigh. The wool is undyed in most cases, the natural grey-brown of the Soay-type sheep kept in small flocks near the settlement. Some tunics are dyed in muted shades of yellow or rust, using weld or bracken root, plants gathered from the hillsides nearby. The tunic is pinned at one shoulder with a simple iron brooch, cast in a workshop 2 valleys to the north. He pulls a rectangular cloak around himself before stepping outside. The cloak is heavier wool, loosely woven, good against the wet. Outside, the dew is heavy on the grass. The settlement sits on a low ridge above a bend in the river. From here, on a clear morning, you can see 3 hilltops. 2 of them carry the earthwork banks and ditches of older hill forts, now only partly occupied. The third is bare, with a scattering of standing stones near its summit that are already ancient by 83 AD, raised perhaps 2,000 years before. The stones are not discussed in any record that survives. But they are there, and the people walking past them each day know their position, as well as they know the position of the trees on the ridge. The trees are everywhere. The great wood of Caledonia, which the Romans call the Silver Caledonia, is not a single continuous forest, but a vast and varied spread of woodland. Here, near the valley floors, it is mainly oak and ash, with hazel thickets filling the spaces between. On the upper slopes, birch takes over, and higher still, above the tree line, The open ground is heather and rough grass. The forest is not untouched. It has been managed for generations. Sections are coppiced, cut back to the stool every several years to produce straight poles for construction. Other areas are left to grow tall timber for roof beams and boat planks. Before the men and women go to their work, there is a morning meal. It is simple and the same most days. The staple grain is here a form of hulled barley, grown in small fields cleared from the forest edge. The barley is ground on a rotary quern, a pair of flat circular stones, the upper one turned by hand using a wooden peg set into a hole near the edge. The grinding takes time. The flour is coarse, with occasional grit from the stone itself. From this flour, a thick porridge is made, boiled in a ceramic pot set directly over the hearth or in a wooden vessel using heated stones dropped into the liquid. This is the morning meal. It is eaten from a wooden bowl, using a spoon carved from a single piece of elder or willow. There may also be dried fish. The rivers here are full of salmon and brown trout. In summer and autumn, they are caught in large numbers using wicker traps set into the current or with simple nets of twisted plant fiber. The fish are split and dried on wooden frames in the wind or smoked over a slow fire of green wood. Some are packed into wooden barrels or ceramic jars with salt brought inland by trade from the coast. Dried fish keeps through the winter and provides food early in the morning when there is no time to cook at length. There is no bread in the modern sense. Flatbreads are sometimes baked on a flat hearthstone, but this is not a daily practice. There is no sweetener except wild honey, which is gathered in small quantities from tree hollows and rock crevices in late summer. Hazelnuts from the coppiced woodland are stored in quantity, dried and kept in pottery jars or skin bags. They are eaten as they are or ground into a paste. They are an important source of fat and calories through the winter months. The craftsmen and workers of these settlements wake to particular tasks tied to the season. In late summer, the work is weighted toward harvest and preparation for cold weather. But the specialist trades continue regardless of the season, and several men in this settlement are occupied full-time in work that demands skill built over years. The smith works in iron. His forge is a separate small structure set a little apart from the main cluster of houses, partly because of the fire risk and partly because of the noise. The structure is simple, a low stone wall on 3 sides with a roof of turf. The bellows are made from the sewn hide of a young deer, fitted with wooden handles and a clay nozzle. The hearth is a stone-lined pit set into the ground, fed with charcoal made in the forest from coppiced wood. Iron ore comes from bog iron, the reddish nodules of ferrous material that form in the waterlogged ground near the river margins. It is collected by hand, dried, and smelted on site. The smith produces practical objects. He makes iron axe heads, adds blades for woodworking, small knives, hooks, pins, and the simple ring brooches that fasten cloaks and tunics. He also makes the iron tires fitted around the wooden wheels of carts, heated in the forge, and hammered onto the wheel rim while hot, then quenched in water to shrink them tight. The work requires a striker as well as the smith himself, a younger man who swings the heavy hammer on command, while the smith holds the work with long tongs and directs the shaping. The wheelwright who provides those wooden wheels works in a shelter near the forest edge. He uses a small number of specialist tools, all of which he has made himself or had made by the smith. He works green wood for the hub and the rim sections, and straight-grained dry wood for the spokes. The wood of choice for the hub is elm, which does not split easily around a central hole. The spokes are riven from straight-grained ash, split along the grain rather than sawn, so the fibers run continuously and the spoke does not break across its width. The rim sections, the felloes, are bent from steamed ash or oak, shaped over a wooden former and pegged into place. The carpenter who works on structural timber uses a heavy iron axe to fell and trim trees, and a smaller adze to dress the surface of beams and posts. He does not have a metal saw. Planks are split from the log using iron or wooden wedges driven into the grain, a technique called riving or cleaving. The resulting planks are uneven by modern standards, but structurally sound because the grain is never cut across. A new roundhouse requires dozens of upright posts, each perhaps 2 meters long and 10 centimeters in diameter, and these are cut and trimmed and pointed at the lower end for driving into the ground. The distance these workers walk to their tasks is not great. The settlement and its immediate hinterland are perhaps a kilometer across. The forest work may take a man 2 or 3 kilometers into the trees, but this is the far edge of the daily range. There are no roads in this landscape. There are tracks worn into the ground by generations of feet and the hooves of cattle. The tracks follow the contours, avoiding the wettest ground, passing through gaps in the forest where the canopy thins naturally. A man carrying tools will walk these tracks at a steady pace, arriving at his work within half an hour of leaving the settlement. The women of the settlement are not idle during this early morning movement. Textile production is continuous and essential. Every adult woman in these communities spins wool using a hand spindle. The spindle is a straight wooden rod, perhaps 30 centimeters long, weighted at the lower end, with a small ceramic or stone whirl that keeps it spinning. The raw wool is held on a distaff, a longer stick tucked under the arm or held in the left hand. The spinner draws fibers out with her fingers and sets the spindle turning with a flick of the wrist, walking or standing, producing a continuous thread that winds onto the rod below the whirl. The loom used for weaving is a warp-weighted loom. It stands upright, leaning against the inside wall of the roundhouse or under a simple shelter outside. The warp threads hang vertically from a horizontal beam and are kept taut by groups of clay loom weights, disc-shaped or cylindrical, strung along the lower ends. The weaver passes the weft thread horizontally through the warp, beating it upward with a flat bone or antler sword beater. The resulting cloth is tight and durable. A single length of cloth wide enough for a tunic or cloak takes many days of continuous work to produce. There are also potters in these communities, though pottery in this period is made by hand rather than on a wheel. The clay is gathered from the river bank, worked with the hands to remove stones and air pockets, and built up by coiling, adding rings of clay one above the other, and smoothing the joins. The pots are plain for the most part, sometimes decorated with fingernail impressions or a simple comb pattern pressed into the soft clay before firing. They are fired in a simple open bonfire or a shallow pit kiln, reaching temperatures sufficient to harden the clay, but lower than a wood-fired kiln of later centuries. The result is an earthenware that is porous and relatively fragile. Pots break and must be replaced regularly. Leather is another material in constant use. The tanner works with hides from cattle, deer, and sheep. The process of preparation begins with scraping the hide clean on a wooden beam using an iron or bone scraper, then soaking it in a solution of water and the tannin-rich bark of oak, which has been stripped from the coppice poles and dried. The tanning process takes weeks. The finished leather is used for shoes, bags, harness straps, knife sheaths, and the covers of small wooden containers. Shoes in this period are simple constructions, a single piece of leather drawn up around the foot and laced or pegged at the ankle. The people of this settlement also work with bone and antler. Antler shed naturally by red deer in early spring is collected from the forest floor, a practice that requires no hunting. It is a dense and workable material. Combs are made by cutting the tines from the main beam, then slicing the beam into flat sections and cutting the teeth with a fine iron saw or flint blade. Two outer plates are riveted to a central toothed strip using small iron rivets. The comb is then smoothed with abrasive stone. Personal grooming combs appear frequently in the archaeological record of this period, suggesting they are common objects, not luxury items. The morning advances. The light grows stronger over the eastern hills. The settlement has been moving for perhaps 2 hours now. Fires are burning outside as well as in, used for cooking, for craft work requiring heat, and for keeping animals near the enclosure calm. The cattle are lowing in their enclosure, a circular pen of woven hazel hurdles reinforced with upright posts. They will be let out to graze on the cleared ground between the forest edge and the river, watched over by a boy of perhaps 12 years who carries a long wooden staff. The grass here is cropped short and shows the marks of long use, the bare patches where cattle stand and the darker green where dung has been worked into the soil over many seasons. The stone circles on the hilltops above are already old. They were raised by people whose names are entirely unknown, using techniques that left no written record. The stones themselves are sandstone and granite, selected from outcrops and transporting using wooden sledges, ropes twisted from plant fiber, and the sustained effort of a large number of people working together. By 83 AD, the circles have stood for perhaps 1,500 years or more. They are still visible from the settlement below and the people moving through their morning routines. The oak forests of Caledonia stretch without interruption across the hills that the Romans would later record as the Caledonian wood. In 83 AD, those trees are standing in their full, unmanaged weight. The canopy is dense enough to hold the morning mist low against the ground until well past the second hour of daylight. The people of this land are working before the light is full. They have been awake since before dawn. The rhythm of their day is set by the season, and in the late summer of 83 AD, the season is pressing hard. The main work of this time and this place is connected to the forest itself. Timber is being cut, stripped, and shaped. The tribes of what the Romans call Caledonia, including the Caledonii in the central Highlands and the Vacamagi further east toward the River Tay, rely on worked timber for nearly every structure they build and every tool they fashion. The process begins before the tree falls. A man selects a tree by reading its grain and its straightness from the outside. He looks at the way the bark sits, the way the trunk rises without twist. Oak is preferred for structural posts. Birch is taken for tool handles and smaller frames. Alder, which grows thick along the boggy ground near the rivers, is cut for anything that will sit in water, because alder hardens when it stays wet rather than rotting away. The selection itself takes time. A poorly chosen tree wastes a morning of felling and splitting. The axe in use at this period is a socketed iron axe. Iron has been worked in Britain for several centuries by 83 AD, and the tribes of Caledonia are not without access to it, though iron objects remain precious enough to be repaired many times before being discarded. The socket fits over a wooden haft, typically ash or hazel, and is secured with a wooden wedge driven into the top of the haft from inside. The blade is not wide by later standards. It is narrow and slightly curved at the cutting edge. A skilled man can notch through a birch trunk of moderate girth in fewer than 20 strokes. The sound carries through the still morning air. Each strike rings out, and then the forest absorbs it. There is a pause between strokes that is longer than one might expect. The man is reading the cut, checking the angle, repositioning his feet. The tree does not fall quickly. The work is slow and methodical, and the sound of it is rhythmic rather than urgent. When the trunk falls, it is not left where it lands. Other workers move in with smaller tools. These are handled knives, some with iron blades and some still with flint, because flint tools have not disappeared from practical use even at this late date. They strip the side branches first. The branches are not wasted. Smaller ones become kindling or basket frames. Larger limbs are set aside for secondary uses in construction, as rafters or as fence posts around the enclosures that surround the roundhouses of this period. The roundhouses themselves are the destination for much of this timber. In the late 1st century AD, the dominant domestic structure across Highland Caledonia is a circular building with a central post or ring of posts supporting a conical roof thatched with heather or rush. The walls are wattle and daub over a timber frame, or in some areas dry stone, but the roof structure is always timber. A single large roundhouse might require several dozen substantial posts, cut to a consistent length, and driven into prepared holes in the earth. The men doing this cutting work do not measure in feet or inches. They measure against their own bodies. A post is cut to a man's height and a half, judged by holding the cut section upright. A rafter is cut to a man's arm span and then some. These are practical measurements, and they are consistent within a group of workers who know each other's bodies well. The variation that a modern builder would find alarming is, in practice, absorbed by the flexibility of the construction method. Further along the river valley that drains westward toward the Forth, a different group is working on something more specialized. The land near the water is boggy and soft. The men here are cutting alder poles of a specific length, roughly the height of 2 men, and pointing the lower ends with careful strokes of a hand axe. These poles will be driven into the riverbank to form the foundation of a small dock or landing platform. The river is used for movement of goods. A log raft or a dugout canoe loaded with furs or grain needs a stable place to come ashore. The dugout canoes of this period in Scotland are made from single large trunks, most often oak or pine. The making of one is a long task spread across several days. A trunk is selected and felled, then rolled onto a level surface using wooden levers. The interior is hollowed using a combination of controlled burning and adze work. The adze is a tool with a blade mounted at a right angle to the handle, used in a downward chopping motion. It removes wood efficiently when the worker has the angle correct. The burns are set to soften the wood and speed the hollowing, and then scraped out while still warm. The smell of scorched oak is particular and heavy, and it hangs in the air around the building site long after the fire is out. The adze strokes have a sound quite different from axe work. They are shorter, sharper, less resonant. They come in a rapid sequence as the worker swings from the wrist rather than the shoulder. A man hollowing a canoe hull sits or kneels inside the growing cavity and works the wood beside and beneath him. His position is cramped and his movements are small. He shifts his weight constantly to reach different sections of the interior. Beyond the river work, the majority of the population of this region in 83 AD is occupied with agriculture and herding. The cattle kept by the Caledonian tribes are small, dark, and hardy. They are not the large beef cattle of later periods. They stand roughly to a man's shoulder and are kept as much for milk as for meat. In the summer months, they are driven to higher ground, to the rough upland pastures above the tree line. The people who tend them move with them. The grain being cultivated in the lower valleys in this period is primarily emmer wheat and bearer, a form of barley that tolerates the short Scottish growing season. The fields are not large by later agricultural standards. They are small, irregular patches cleared from the forest margin and cultivated with an ard, which is a simple plough without a moldboard. The ard scratches a furrow without turning the soil over. It is pulled by oxen where the ground is clear enough, and by human labor where the terrain is too rough or too small. The ard is made largely of wood. The tip, the part that contacts the ground, is sometimes shod with iron, but in many cases it is simply a hardwood point, replaced when it wears down. The beam connecting the tip to the yoke is long and slightly curved. The crosspiece that the ploughman holds is set at the rear. The whole implement is light enough for one person to carry over one shoulder between fields. This is not a tool designed for permanence. It is designed to be repaired and rebuilt as needed. The grain fields in late summer of 83 AD are approaching harvest. The crop stands at roughly waist height. The heads of bearer barley are dense and slightly drooping under their own weight. They move in a slow wave when the wind comes down from the north, which it does most afternoons. The harvest tool is the sickle. The iron sickles of this period are single-bladed and curved, with a wooden or bone handle fixed to a tang. The cutting action is a pulling stroke, drawing the blade through the base of the stalk. The workers cut in a line across the field, moving in the same direction, each one clearing a strip roughly an arm's length wide. They work bent at the waist. This is heavy work on the lower back, and the workers straighten periodically and press one hand flat against the lumbar region before bending again. The cut stalks are gathered into bundles by a second group of workers moving behind the cutters. The bundles are tied with a few stalks twisted around them and then stacked upright in the field in small groups to dry. The drying process takes several days in good weather, longer if the late summer clouds close in from the west, which they frequently do. Once dry, the grain is beaten from the stalk over a flat stone or a stretched hide. This process, threshing, is done with a wooden beater, a simple stick with a heavier section at the striking end. The grain falls free and is gathered from the threshing surface into leather bags or shallow wooden troughs. From the threshing floor, the grain moves to storage. The storage structures used in this period in Highland Scotland are small raised granaries set on 4 or 6 posts to keep the floor above the reach of ground moisture and rodents. The posts are capped with flat stones, like the Staddle stones recorded from later periods in England, though in Caledonia they are less uniform in shape. The raised floor is planked with split timber. The walls are wattle. The roof is thatched. A well-maintained granary of this type can keep grain dry and edible through a Scottish winter. The grinding of grain into flour is women's work in this period, based on the archaeological distribution of quern stones found in and around domestic structures. The quern in use in 83 AD across much of Scotland is the rotary quern, a significant improvement over the older saddle quern that required a back-and-forth grinding action. The rotary quern has 2 circular stones, one sitting atop the other. The upper stone is turned by a wooden handle inserted into a hole near the edge. Grain is fed through a central hole in the upper stone and emerges as flour from the gap between the stones. The turning is repetitive. The upper stone is heavy, typically sandstone of a gritty texture that wears slowly and grinds efficiently. One revolution of the upper stone takes a few seconds. A woman grinding flour for a household's daily needs might turn the quern for an hour or more each morning. The sound is a low, continuous scraping, consistent and unhurried. Flour of this period is coarser than modern flour. The bread made from it is dense and requires no leavening agent to be satisfying as a staple food. The bread itself is baked on a flat stone set near or over the fire at the center of the roundhouse. The fire in a roundhouse of 83 AD burns without a chimney. Smoke rises to the thatch above and filters out through the apex of the roof, which is left slightly open. The interior is dark and smoke-tinged for much of the day. Eyes adjust slowly to it coming in from outside. The floor is beaten earth, sometimes covered with rushes or bracken that are replaced when they become too dirty. Near the forest edge, a short distance from the main settlement cluster, another group of workers is engaged with something different from timber and grain. They are working hides. The cattle and deer hides of this season are stretched on wooden frames made from lashed poles. The frames stand roughly vertical, leaning slightly back. The hides are pegged to the frames at their edges, using wooden pegs driven through small holes cut just inside the margin of the skin. The cleaning of the hide is done with a scraper. This is a tool with a short, broad iron blade mounted at roughly a right angle to its handle. The worker draws it across the inner surface of the hide in firm, repetitive strokes, removing the membrane and fat that clings to the inner side of the skin. The removed material falls to the ground. It accumulates around the base of the frames by the end of a working day, a pale and greasy residue. The smell is strong and specific, not unpleasant to those accustomed to it, but striking to anyone who has not encountered fresh hide work before. Once cleaned, the hide is treated with a mixture of oak bark and water. The tannins in the oak bark bind to the proteins in the skin and begin the process of converting it from a perishable material into leather. This process is slow. A thick cattle hide may require weeks of repeated treatment before it is sufficiently tanned to be useful. The tanning troughs used in this period are simple pits lined with clay dug near a reliable water source. The Caledonii dig them close enough to a stream that water can be diverted with minimal labor. The leather produced from this process is dark and relatively stiff. It is used for shoes, for bags, for harness components, for the covers of shields. The shoes of this period in Scotland are simple cut pieces sold with thicker leather and wrapped around the foot, secured with leather laces threaded through punched holes around the upper. They are not shaped precisely to the foot. They are functional and replaceable. The tools used to punch the lace holes are fine bone awls with iron tips, the tip being replaced when it dulls. The bone awl is among the smallest tools in daily use in Caledonia in 83 AD. It sits easily in a closed fist. The tip is fine enough to pierce tanned leather cleanly without tearing. The worker rests the leather on a flat stone or The fire has been burning since before dawn. It sits in a shallow pit at the center of the floor, ringed with flat stones gathered from the nearest burn. The smoke rises slowly and finds its way out through a gap in the thatched roof above. There is no chimney, there has never been a chimney here. The house itself is round. It is perhaps 12 meters across at its widest point. The walls are built from upright timber posts sunk deep into the ground, with wattle woven between them and daub pressed into every gap. The daub is a mixture of clay, animal dung, and chopped straw. It dries hard in summer and softens slightly in the wet months. The whole outer wall is low, perhaps 1.5 meters high, before the roof begins its long slope inward and upward toward the smoke hole. The roof is the true achievement of the building. It rests on an inner ring of heavier posts, set perhaps 5 meters in from the outer wall. These posts are oak, split, and shaped with an adze. They carry a central ring beam, and from that beam the rafters radiate outward like the spokes of a wheel laid on its side. Heather thatch covers the whole structure, layered from the eaves upward, each course overlapping the one below. The thatch is thick, perhaps 1/2 meter deep at its lower edges. Inside, the floor is beaten earth. It has been walked on for so many years that it has become almost as hard as stone in the areas near the fire. Around the edges, closer to the walls, the earth is softer and slightly damp in autumn. Rush matting has been laid down in patches. The rushes come from the wetland ground about 400 meters to the east, where a slow stream spreads into a shallow marsh before it gathers itself again and runs south. The inner ring of posts divides the interior into 2 zones. The outer ring, between the heavy posts and the wattle wall, is where animals sleep in winter. There is a low partition of woven hurdles separating the animal end from the human end. It is not a wall, it is more of a suggestion. The smell of cattle moves freely through the whole space. 2 or 3 small cattle and perhaps 4 or 5 sheep occupy this outer section on cold nights. Their body heat contributes to the warmth of the house. The human sleeping area is arranged around the fire. There are no beds in the way that word would come to be understood. There are platforms of timber, low to the ground, built against the inner face of the outer wall. On these platforms lie skins, red deer hide mostly. Some cattle hide, tanned and softened by working with fat and brains over many weeks. On top of the skins lie folded woolen textiles. The wool has been dyed with weld and woad and bracken root. The colors are muted yellows, pale blues, and a dark brownish green that is almost the color of the surrounding forest in November. A family of perhaps 6 or 7 people sleeps in this space. The youngest children sleep closest to the fire on a lower platform built specifically for them. An older woman, perhaps the grandmother, sleeps on the platform nearest to where the food stores are kept. This is not an accident. She is the one who knows what is in those stores and how long they must last. The food stores are kept in the back section of the roundhouse furthest from the entrance. The entrance faces southeast. This is almost always the case in this part of Caledonia. The reason is partly the wind, which comes most often from the west and northwest, and partly the light, which enters the doorway in the morning and reaches the fire pit directly. Hung from the roof timbers above the store area are dried herbs and smoked meat. There are haunches of deer, smoked over green wood for several days in late autumn. There are bundles of dried watermint, dried thyme gathered from the hillside above the settlement, and dried mushrooms threaded on lengths of twisted grass. Pottery sits on a low shelf built into the wall itself. The pots are coarse and hand-built, not wheel-thrown. The clay has been tempered with crushed stone and fired in a simple pit in the open air. The vessels are not elegant. They are thick-walled and slightly uneven, darkened on their outer surfaces from repeated use over the fire. One large pot holds rendered fat. Another holds dried hazelnuts. A third holds a quantity of dried peas, gathered from the small cultivated plots on the south-facing slope outside the settlement. There is a quern stone near the fire. It is a rotary quern made from two disc-shaped stones of coarse sandstone. The lower stone is fixed. The upper stone has a wooden handle inserted into a hole near its edge. A woman turns this handle in the morning and grain falls slowly through the central hole and emerges as a coarse flour from the gap between the two stones. The grain is emmer wheat, grown in the small fields below the settlement, harvested in August with a small iron sickle. The flour is mixed with water and pressed into flat cakes, which are baked directly on the flat stones surrounding the fire. The children are up before full light. They do not sleep late. There is no arrangement in this household that permits sleeping late. The fire must be fed, the animals must be let out, water must be fetched from the burn, and the morning cakes must be made. Children of 5 or 6 carry out several of these tasks without being directed to do so. It is simply what the morning requires. Clothing for the children is simple. A tunic of undyed wool, belted at the waist with a leather strip. No shoes in summer. In winter, simple leather wrappings bound around the foot and ankle. The leather comes from cattle hides cured within the household. An adult woman in this settlement wears a longer woolen garment, pinned at the shoulder with a simple bronze pin. The bronze was not made here. It arrived through exchange, passed along a network of contacts that extends south and east over many generations. The adult men and older boys leave the settlement early. In October, which is approximately where we are in the year 83, they are engaged in harvesting and storing. The grain has already been cut and threshed. Now they are gathering bracken for winter bedding, cutting timber for repairs to the outer wall of one of the roundhouses on the northern side of the settlement, and checking the drying racks where the smoked venison hangs in the cool air. The drying racks are outside, built of lashed poles, standing about 2 meters high, positioned where the prevailing wind passes through them most reliably. The settlement contains perhaps 4 or 5 roundhouses arranged loosely around a central open area. There is no formal plan to this arrangement. The houses were built where the ground was firmest and where drainage was good. Between the houses, the ground is churned and soft from foot traffic and animal movement. There is a larger structure at the western edge of the settlement, slightly longer than round. This is where grain is stored in the dry. It is raised slightly off the ground on short timber posts to keep moisture out and discourage rodents. The forest begins at the edge of the settlement, and it is a genuine forest, not thinned or managed in the way it would become. Oak and ash and birch grow close together. The understory is hazel, which is coppiced in rotation, the cut poles used for wattle and tool handles, and the construction of hurdles. The hazelnuts are gathered in September. Children do much of this work, moving along the coppiced rows with wooden buckets, filling them quickly because the squirrels and dormice and jays are all working the same harvest at the same time. The nearest stone circle stands about 600 meters northwest of the settlement, on slightly elevated ground where the tree cover thins. It is a modest circle, perhaps 8 stones remaining upright, each one between 1 and 2 meters tall. The stones are local granite, unhewn but selected for their shape. The circle has been there for well over 2,000 years before this October in 83 AD. The people living in this settlement did not build it. They are aware of it. They use the space around it for certain gatherings, but its original purpose and the beliefs that raised it are already obscured by time. A particular stone at the northeast of the circle is aligned with the rising point of the midsummer sun. This has been noticed and is understood in a general way. The knowledge is held by an older member of the community, a man or woman who carries the ritual responsibilities of the group. This person is not a full-time specialist. They also plant crops and tend animals and carry firewood. The distinction between ritual knowledge and practical knowledge is not sharp here. Both kinds of knowing are part of the same unbroken understanding of how the world works. Water is carried to the settlement in wooden buckets and in the larger coarse pottery vessels. The burn to the east provides clean water through most of the year. In late summer, it runs low but does not dry up entirely. The women and older children make this journey several times a day. The path to the burn is well worn, a clear track through the grass and bracken, slightly sunken in one section where it crosses softer ground. Inside the roundhouse again, in the middle of the afternoon, the fire has settled to a low, steady burn. The smoke in the upper part of the interior is thick enough to sting the eyes if you stand upright for too long. Most work is done seated or crouching. A woman sits near the fire working wool. She holds a drop spindle, a weighted stick with a disc of baked clay at its lower end. She draws fibers from a mass of combed wool held on a separate stick tucked under her arm. The spindle drops and rotates, and the thread forms with a slow, continuous tension. The rhythm is practiced and even. Another woman is working on a loom set against the inner face of the outer wall. The loom is vertical, a warp-weighted loom. Rows of clay weights, round and pierced, hang at the bottom of the warp threads and keep them taut. The weaver passes a wooden shuttle back and forth through the shed, pressing each weft thread down with a long, flat beater. The fabric growing from the top of the loom is a plain tabby weave, undyed, a natural grey-brown from the fleece of the local sheep. The children return in the late afternoon. The younger ones come back from wherever they have been playing and working at the edges of the settlement. An older girl, perhaps 11 or 12, comes back from the cultivated plots where she has been pulling the last of the late-season roots, a variety of fat hen and some wild turnip gathered from the margins of the field. She carries them in a woven basket, the weave made from thin willow strips. She sets the basket down near the fire without comment and crouches to warm her hands. The evening meal is a single large pot set directly over the fire on a simple iron tripod. The pot holds water, barley, some dried peas, a small quantity of smoked meat pulled from the hanging store, and several of the roots the girl has just brought in. The whole thing simmers for a long time. There is no particular recipe and no fixed proportions. What goes into the pot is what is available and what the pot will hold. Everyone in the household eats from the same vessel, using wooden spoons and small wooden bowls. The bowls are turned on a simple pole lathe, produced by a specialist in a nearby settlement who trades them for grain or wool. Outside, the light is going from the sky over the western tree line. The cattle have been brought back inside the outer section of the roundhouse. One of the adult men has wedged the door shut with a timber brace. The door itself is a simple wooden frame covered with cattle hide, hung on leather hinges. It does not seal perfectly. Cold air moves around its edges. A strip of folded wool has been pressed into the gap at the bottom. The fire is built up with two larger pieces of oak. They will burn slowly through the night. The oak was cut last winter and has been seasoning in a covered stack at the edge of the settlement since March. Dry oak holds a long, steady heat. It is preferred for night burning precisely because it does not require attention. The household settles. The youngest children are already asleep on their platform near the fire. The spindle rests on the floor beside the woman who was working it. The loom stands against the wall in the dimming light, its clay weights hanging still, and the oak trees stand close together here. Their canopy holds the last of the evening light, and the ground beneath them is dark and soft with decades of fallen leaves. In 83 AD, this forest has no name that any Roman cartographer has written down. The people who live within it do not call it Caledonia. That word belongs to the men camped to the south, behind their ditches and their timber walls. The people here simply know the forest as the place they come from. There are no towns in the Roman sense, no forums, no colonnaded streets, no public baths. What exists instead is a loose web of settlements, each one a cluster of roundhouses set within a cleared space among the trees. The roundhouses are built from timber posts driven into the ground, with walls of wattle daubed with clay and dung, and roofs of thatch cut from the reed beds near the rivers. A settlement might hold 4 or 5 such houses, or it might hold 12. The largest known concentrations in this period sit on defended hilltops, within rings of earthen rampart and timber palisade. The hill fort at Traprain-Law rises above the low ground of what will one day be called East Lothian. It is occupied and active in this period, a place where perhaps several hundred people gather at certain times of the year. The summit is broad and flat enough for permanent structures. Below it, the fields have been worked into narrow cultivation terraces cut into the slope, and the lower ground holds cattle pennied behind post and wattle fencing. Traprain Law is not the only such place. Eildon Hill North, in the Tweed Valley, bears the marks of hundreds of roundhouse platforms cut into its flanks. At its peak of occupation, it may have held one of the largest communities in northern Britain. These hill forts are not simply defended villages. They function as gathering places. People come to them from the surrounding landscape, from farms and small settlements spread across several miles of valley and forest edge. They bring goods. They bring animals. They bring grievances and news and the need to be among a larger group of people for a time. The gathering is the market and the meeting and the ceremony all at once. There is no separation between these functions. The same day that cattle are exchanged, the same day that disputes over land or livestock are settled, the same fire is lit for purposes that the Romans would call religious. Religion in 83 AD in this part of the world has no temples. It has no priests in the Christian sense, no congregations, no fixed days of formal worship separated from the rest of life. What it has is the natural world itself, understood as full of presences that require acknowledgement. The Druids, as described by Greek and Roman writers of the preceding century, are the learned class who tend this relationship. They memorize vast amounts of knowledge. They observe the sky. They know when the year turns. They do not write any of this down. Julius Caesar noted in the previous century that the Druids of Gaul deliberately avoided writing to preserve the discipline of memory. There is no clear reason to suppose the practice in northern Britain differed. The year is not divided into weeks in any way that resembles what will come later. There is no Sunday. There is no market day in the weekly sense. Time moves differently. The primary divisions are the great seasonal turning points, and these are the moments when gatherings happen, when the ordinary rhythm of daily work pauses, when the community does something together rather than separately. The four principal festivals are known through later Irish sources, which preserve the oldest layer of Celtic practice. They are Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad. Each marks a threshold in the agricultural and pastoral year. Samhain falls at the beginning of what we would call November. The cattle have been brought down from the summer pastures by this point. Some will be slaughtered now because the hay and fodder stored through the summer months cannot sustain the full herd through winter. The meat is preserved in salt or dried or packed into clay-sealed vessels. The bones go into the fire. Samhain is understood as a time when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes less fixed. The ancestors are present or felt to be present. Food may be left at the threshold of a house. Fires are lit on high ground. Imbolc comes in what we would call early February. It is associated with the first signs of the return of warmth and with the beginning of the lambing season. The ewes begin to produce milk again around this time. This is significant in a world where the winter months have been lean and where the return of fresh animal milk represents a genuine change in the diet. Imbolc is quieter than sound. It is a household observance as much as a communal one. The fire in the central hearth of a roundhouse is tended with particular care at this time. The hearth is the practical center of the house, and in this period it is also understood as something more than practical. Beltane falls at the beginning of May. This is the most openly communal of the 4 festivals. The cattle are being moved back up to the higher summer pastures at this time, and in the days around Beltane, large fires are lit. The cattle are driven between 2 fires or close to a fire before the move to summer ground. This is understood as a protective act. It is also a gathering. The movement of animals requires the movement of people, and the movement of people along the paths between settlements is when news travels, when alliances are confirmed, when young men and women from different family groups come into contact with one another. Lugnasad falls at the beginning of August. It marks the beginning of the harvest, the first grain cut from the cultivated ground, the first evidence that the year's work has produced something to eat, is acknowledged at this time. Later sources describe games and competitions associated with Lugnasad, as well as the settlement of contracts and the resolution of disputes. The assembly at a hill fort in late July or early August, with people arriving from the surrounding landscape, with animals being traded and disputes heard and marriages agreed, carries the character of what this festival represents. It is an occasion with practical function and ceremonial weight at the same time. Between these 4 points, daily life follows the demands of the land and the animals. In the early morning, before the light is fully established, the fire in the roundhouse is brought back from its banked state overnight. Women carry water from the nearest stream or spring. The water vessels are ceramic, round-bottomed pots made locally, or they are wooden buckets with iron-fitted staves. The morning meal is likely a porridge of ground grain, barley or oats, cooked in a ceramic vessel over the hearth. This is not a plain thing. Fat rendered from animals, dried berries, or whatever remains from the day before goes into it. The men of a settlement are occupied in the morning with animals. Cattle require attention. Pigs forage in the woodland under the supervision of a person whose job is to follow them and keep them from wandering too far. Sheep on the upland ground need checking. The daily movement between the settlement and the field, or the grazing ground, is the basic rhythm of the working day. Women carry out a wide range of tasks within the settlement. Grinding grain on a saddle quern, the flat stone tool set at knee height that requires long physical effort to use, spinning wool onto a hand spindle weighted with a ceramic whirl, weaving on an upright loom set against the inside wall of a roundhouse. The children of a settlement are not separated from this work. They carry things, they watch animals, they learn by proximity. There is no building set aside for their instruction. Knowledge is transmitted in the doing of things and in the listening to the older members of the community during the evenings around the fire. The firelight in a roundhouse in the evening is the primary occasion for storytelling, for the transmission of genealogy and myth and practical knowledge, about the landscape. The Druids among this population hold the most elaborate and carefully preserved versions of this knowledge, but every household has its own stock of inherited understanding about the local land. The stone circles that still stand in this landscape in 83 AD are old. Some of them are more than 2,000 years old already by this date. The great monument at Callanish on the Isle of Lewis was constructed in something like 2900 BC. The ring of Brodgar in Orkney is similarly ancient. The people living in the forests of Caledonia in 83 AD are not the people who built these monuments. They are separated from the builders by as much time as separates us today from the Roman occupation itself. The circles stand in the landscape as inherited presences. Their original purpose may no longer be fully understood by the communities living near them. But they are not ignored. There is good evidence from later practice and from the deposit of objects at ancient monuments throughout the prehistoric and early historic periods that sites of great antiquity remain places where things are done, offerings made, and gatherings held, long after the original reasons for their construction have become obscure. A stone circle in a cleared space among the trees is a place that people know about. It is a reference point in the landscape. The fact that it is old makes it significant, not irrelevant. The stones themselves are understood as possessing presence. At the loch's edge on a still morning, before the settlement has fully woken, the water holds the reflection of the trees on the far bank. There is a birch forest beginning about 30 feet from the water. The ground between the water and the trees is boggy in this period, wetter than it will be in later centuries when drainage changes the land. Across this kind of landscape, paths between settlements follow the high ground. The ridgelines are the roots. The valley floors are avoided where possible. The paths are not paved or maintained. They are simply the lines of laced resistance through the terrain, worn by the passage of feet and animals over generations. Along these paths, at the times of the great seasonal gatherings, people move in small groups. A family from a farmstead 3 miles from the nearest hill fort sets out before dawn to arrive before the day is too far advanced. They carry things, a length of woven cloth, a small number of grain measures in a leather bag. Several cured hides. These are the portable forms of surplus that can be exchanged for things the family cannot make or grow itself. Iron, particularly, is something that most households cannot produce. The iron for a plowshare, a sickle blade, an axe head comes from specialists, from smiths who work at or near the larger settlements. The smith is one of the few people in this world whose role is defined by craft rather than land. At the gathering, the exchange of goods happens without a fixed market structure. There is no stall, no price list, no currency in common use across this region in 83 AD. What exists is a system of equivalence understood by both parties, embedded in social relationships, in the relative status of the people involved, in the history of previous exchanges between families. A man who is well regarded, whose grandfather was known for fair dealing, operates in this system with an advantage. A man from a family with disputed claims or a history of dishonesty finds exchange more difficult. Reputation is the medium. The Druids at such a gathering move through the crowd with authority. Their robes in later descriptions are white, though this detail comes from Roman sources that may be simplifying or romanticizing. What is more certain is that they are visually distinct from the rest of the population, and that their role gives them a degree of safety that ordinary people do not have. A druid can travel between warring groups. A druid can speak at an assembly and expect to be heard without interruption. Their long years of memorized learning, which Caesar suggested could last 20 years of study, mark them as a separate class of person. The evening of a great gathering day begins to settle over the hill fort. The fire in the center of the open ground has been burning since the morning. Around it, people sit in groups. The animals pennied nearby are quiet now. The exchange of goods that occupied the afternoon has concluded. The formal proceedings of the assembly, disputes heard and judgments delivered, have been completed while the light was still good enough to see. Now the fire draws people toward it. The smell of roasting meat crosses the clearing. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a person is playing a stringed instrument. The sound is not loud. It carries just far enough to reach the people sitting nearest, and they listen without turning to look, watching instead the fire. The air above the great forest smelled of wet pine resin and river mud. It was late in the year, somewhere in the final weeks before the ground hardened. The trees stood close together across the central spine of the land, their trunks dark with moisture, their lower branches hung with pale lichen. This was not a tidy woodland. It was old growth, tangled and slow, the kind of forest that had been growing in the same place since before anyone in these hills had a name for it. The Caledonian forest at this time covered the high ground between what would much later be called the Great Glen and the southern uplands. Scots pine dominated the ridges. Birch grew lower down, along the stream edges and the boggy ground where drainage was poor. Alder stood in the wet hollows, its roots permanently in standing water. Oak grew further south and east, where the soil was deeper and the winters slightly less severe. These were not uniform stands of a single species. They were mixed, uneven, broken by clearings, by river courses, by outcrops of exposed rock where nothing rooted at all. The rivers moved through all of this without pause. The Tay was already draining the broad central basin, running east through a wide flat valley before turning south toward the Firth. Its upper reaches passed through dense woodland on both banks. The water was clear in the shallows and very cold even in summer. Salmon moved through it in large numbers in autumn, pushing upstream from the sea to reach the graveled beds where they had hatched years before. People along the Tay knew this rhythm precisely. They had built weir structures of woven hazel and upright stakes at certain bends, angling them across the current to trap fish as they moved upstream. These were not elaborate. They were functional, repaired each season moved slightly when the channel shifted. Further north, the rivers feeding into the Murray Firth came down fast from the high plateau. The Findhorn, the Nairn, the Spey. The Spey in particular carried an enormous volume of water, running over a wide gravel bed in its lower reaches. The gravel shifted with each major flood. Trees had fallen into the channel at various points along its length and lay there still, half submerged, their root systems breaking the current into white water. Otters denned along this stretch, under the exposed roots of bankside alders. Red deer came to drink at dawn and dusk. These were behaviors unchanged across many generations of human observation. The coastline facing east was different from the western shore. The Murray Firth formed a sheltered inlet, its waters generally calmer than the open Atlantic. Small harbours existed at this time, though they were not built harbours in any permanent sense. They were natural inlets, deepened slightly by use, where the seabed was firm enough to take the weight of a grounded vessel. Boats were pulled up onto the beach at the end of each day. They were clinker-built in the northern tradition, light enough to be dragged by a small group of men. Some had a single mast. Others were rowed entirely. The fishing here was for herring, for cod, and for the flatfish that lay on the muddy bottom of the inner firths. The western coast was wilder. Sea locks cut deep into the land, some of them running nearly 20 miles inland. These locks were tidal in their outer sections and fresh in their inner reaches, where streams came down from the hills. The banks of these sea locks were thick with birch and hazel scrub below the tree line, and above it, open moorland stretched away to the peaks. The moorland was not empty. Peat bogs occupied the wetter sections. Cotton grass grew in dense white-headed stands across the flat ground where drainage was slowest. Heather covered the drier ridges, purple in late summer and brown and silver through the winter months. The livestock of this period were small animals by later standards. Cattle were short-legged and dark-coated, similar in type to what would later be called Celtic shorthorn. They were kept in small numbers per household, rarely more than a dozen head for any one group. They grazed the open ground in summer and were brought close to the settlement when the weather turned. Some were overwintered inside, in the lower sections of roundhouses where their body heat helped warm the space above. Sheep were here too, a primitive type with a coarse double coat that shed naturally in spring. They needed less shelter than the cattle and could graze further up the slope in winter if the snow was not deep. Pigs were kept at the woodland edge. They ranged into the forest in autumn, feeding on acorns and beech mast. This was a managed behavior. The pigs were not wild, though they looked it. They were slaughtered in late autumn when they had put on weight from the forest mast and before the hard work of overwintering them began. The meat was preserved in salt or by smoking over a slow peat fire. This was November work, the smell of it drifting across the settlement for several days. Horses existed in small numbers. They were used for movement across difficult ground rather than for pulling loads. The terrain of the uplands did not suit wheeled transport. There were no roads in the Roman sense north of the Forth at this time. There were trackways, worn into the peat by generations of foot traffic and herd movement. Some of these followed the ridges, where the ground was firmer. Others descended into the glens along routes that were only usable in dry weather. A generation before, meaning roughly 50 years earlier, around the middle of the 1st century, the landscape had been broadly the same, but the human settlement patterns were somewhat different. The hill forts were more heavily occupied. These were defensive enclosures built on prominent hilltops, their ramparts of stone or timber and earth enclosing a considerable area. Traprain-Law in the south was one such place, occupied continuously across a long period. Further north, smaller hill forts stood on ridges overlooking river valleys and coastal inlets. The people living in them were not cowering behind walls. The hilltop position gave sight lines, controlled movement, projected authority over the surrounding agricultural land. By 83 AD, some of these hill forts had been partially abandoned or had shifted in function. The population was not declining, but it was dispersing. Smaller farmsteads were becoming more common in the lowland zones and in the wider river valleys. These were individual roundhouses or small clusters of 2 or 3 surrounded by a low bank and ditch that marked out the enclosed ground. Cattle were kept within this enclosure at night. Grain was stored in raised granaries, timber structures on 4 or 6 posts lifted off the ground to keep the grain dry and away from rodents. This shift from the concentrated hill fort to the dispersed farmstead was gradual. It had been happening across several generations. The stone circles were older than any of this. They had been built across a much longer period, beginning perhaps 2,000 years before this moment and continuing in various forms until well before the Roman presence on the island became a concern. By 83 AD, the major circles were already ancient structures. The people living near them knew they were old. They were not maintained in any regular sense. Some stones had shifted slightly, laning with the movement of the ground beneath them. The circles at what would later be called Callanish on the Western Isles, the recumbent stone circles of the northeast, the smaller ring settings of Perthshire, all of these were already monuments to an earlier time. The landscape around these circles had changed since their construction. Peat had grown up around the bases of many of the stones. At Callanish, the peat had encroached significantly, burying the lower portions of several standing stones. This peat growth was a record of climatic change and of reduced human activity in certain areas. Where land had been cleared and used for cultivation in the Bronze Age, and then abandoned, the vegetation had shifted toward the bog species. The peat grew slowly but continuously. By the 1st century, some of the stone settings in the higher ground were already half swallowed by it. The seasonal changes in this landscape were pronounced. Spring came late at these latitudes. Snow could fall on the high ground as late as April and again as early as September. The growing season was short. Barley was the main arable crop across most of the region. It was sown in the cleared ground, the infield closest to the settlement, where animal dung had been spread through the winter months. Emma wheat grew in small quantities in the warmer lowland zones. Oats were here too, though their cultivation would expand significantly in later centuries. The harvest in a good year was finished by August. In a poor year, it ran into September, and the grain came in damp. The fallow ground, the outfield, was grazed after harvest and allowed to recover for one or more seasons before being broken again with a simple ard. The ard scratched the soil rather than turning it. It was pulled by a pair of oxen and steered by hand. Crossing the field in two directions, once lengthways and once across, broke the surface well enough for the grain to be sown by hand from a basket. The fields were small by later standards, irregular in shape, following the natural contour of the land rather than imposing a grid on it. Oak woodland in the lower Tay Valley was already being cleared in patches by this period. The clearance had been happening for centuries. Each generation cut a little further into the wood, grubbing out the roots of the felled trees and burning the undergrowth. The cleared ground was cultivated for a few seasons, then left to grass over. This was not permanent deforestation. The trees came back on abandoned land, but the net effect across many generations was a slow reduction in woodland cover in the more productive valleys and a hardening of the tree line at altitude. The beavers were still in the river systems at this time. They had not yet been driven out. They dammed the smaller tributaries, creating ponds of still water behind their constructions of mud and stick. These beaver ponds changed the local hydrology noticeably. They slowed the water, spread it across a wider area, and created the kind of standing wet ground where willow and sedge established quickly. The beaver lodges were substantial. They were built from branches of alder and willow cut close to the water, plastered with mud dredged from the pond bed. A lodge could stand for many years before being abandoned. Red kites flew over the open ground in good numbers. White-tailed eagles held territories along the sea lock coasts and the major river estuaries. These were large birds and conspicuous. Brown bears were present in the deep forest, though not commonly seen. Wolves were more visible, particularly in winter when prey animals were weakened, and the wolves moved in family groups across larger territories. The wolf predation on livestock was a real and constant pressure on anyone keeping sheep or cattle at the woodland edge. It shaped where animals were grazed and at what times of year. The nights in late autumn came early. By the time the sun dropped behind the western hills, the air temperature was already falling sharply. The roundhouses were lit inside by a central hearth of peat and wood, the smoke finding its way out through a gap in the thatch at the apex of the roof. The interior was dark and warm, smelling of smoke and animal and stored grain. People slept in the outer ring of the house, on platforms of timber or on bedding of bracken and heather laid on the packed earth floor. The sleeping arrangements were communal. Privacy was not a concept that the architecture provided for. The rivers froze in the coldest winters, but not every year. The Tay below the confluence with the Tummel was too large and too fast-moving to freeze entirely. The smaller burns and tributaries locked over in January and stayed frozen for weeks at a time in the hardest years. Ice on the standing water of the beaver ponds cracked in the early morning with a sound that carried a long distance across the still air. The hills above the tree line were white for months. The snow lay deepest in the north-facing corries, where the sun did not reach from November through to March. Deer moved down to lower ground, following the snow line as it descended through the winter and retreated again in. The sun drops behind the ridge to the west. It goes slowly, the way it does in late summer this far north. The light does not vanish. It lingers, turning the color of pale copper over the hills. The hills here are not the rounded shapes of the south. They are older, harder, quartzite and schist pushed up over millions of years, worn by ice into long ridges and deep corries. In 83 AD, no track connects these heights to any Roman road. They stand as they have always stood, above everything. Below the tree line, the forest begins. It is dense in a way that is difficult now to picture. Oak, birch, alder, ash, Scots pine further up on the thinner soil. The canopy closes over the lower ground, and beneath it the air is still and cool even when the day has been warm. The forest floor is thick with moss and fallen wood. Deer move through the gaps between the trees without sound. The settlement sits on a dry rise above a river. The river runs northeast here, quick over stones in the shallower stretches, dark and slow in the pools below the bends. The people have lived beside it for generations. They know every reach of it. They know where the salmon hold in autumn and where the water is safe to cross in spate. The houses are roundhouses. Timber posts form the outer ring and wattle fills the gaps between them. The roofs are thatched with reed and heather laid thick enough to turn the rain. A single door faces east or southeast, away from the prevailing wind. There are no windows. Light and smoke share the same hole at the roof's apex. Inside, the central hearth has burned all day. It burns with peat and with slow-cut wood, the kind that gives heat rather than flame. The smoke rises and finds its way out mostly. Some of it stays below the rafters, coating the thatch from the inside with a tar that keeps the damp out and the vermin down. The people who live here do not notice the smell of it. It is simply the smell of indoors. The largest roundhouse in this settlement is perhaps 12 meters across. It holds a family group, the animals in cold weather, and the stored grain in pits cut into the floor and lined with clay. Around it, smaller structures hold tools, hides being worked, dried herbs suspended from the rafters by their stems. The working day in the forest has been long. Timber has been cut, not with iron axes for everyone, but with bronze tools still in use alongside the newer iron ones. Iron is smelted here, but it is not abundant. A man with an iron axe is better equipped than his grandfather was. He knows this. He uses the tool carefully. The trees that have been felled today were chosen weeks ago. The selection is not random. Straight timber for building comes from oak or ash grown close together, where the trees reach up for light and do not branch low. The wood from open-grown trees is curved, useful for other purposes. The people who work the forest know the difference without being told. It is knowledge passed from hand to hand over many years. By late afternoon, the cut timber has been dragged to the edge of the clearing on a simple wooden sledge. Two men guide it. A younger boy holds the rope at the front. The ground is uneven and the work is slow. They stop when the light begins to go. There is no point continuing in poor light when the ground is this rough. The women at the settlement have been working since before the men returned. Grain has been ground on a rotary quern, a flat stone turned by hand, producing a coarse flour that will go into the pot tonight. The quern sits just outside the main door, where the light is better through the middle of the day. The grinding is done in shifts. It is heavy, repetitive work that falls primarily to the women, though not exclusively. The grain itself is emmer wheat and barley. Both have been stored in the pit below the roundhouse floor since the previous autumn. The barley is versatile. It goes into a thick porridge, into a flat bread cooked on a stone beside the fire, and into the fermented drink the community has been producing in a clay vessel stoppered with a wooden bung. The drink is not strong by any measure used later in history, but it is there and it is warming. The meal being prepared this evening is a broth. A clay pot, blackened from regular use, sits on stones beside the central fire. Into it has gone water drawn from the river, dried herbs from the rafters, and a cut of meat from the haunch of a deer killed 3 days ago. The remaining meat has been hung and partly dried. It will last a few more days. Nothing from the kill has been wasted. Alongside the broth, flat barley bread has been baked directly on a hearthstone. It is dense, slightly charred on the underside. It is eaten with the broth, used to soak up the liquid in the bowl. The bowls are turned wood, smooth with use. Some households in the settlement have pottery bowls, hand-built and fired in a pit kiln. The pottery is not decorated with fine patterns. It is functional, thick-walled, serviceable. Children have been in the settlement all day. The youngest stay close to the roundhouse. The older ones range further but come back before the light goes. They have been collecting material at the forest edge, dry bark, fallen cones, things that burn quickly and get the fire started in the morning. This is useful work. It is not play, though it might feel like both. One child has brought back something else, a feather, large and dark-barred, from a bird of prey, perhaps a goshawk hunting in the middle canopy. The goshawk does not announce itself. It comes through the trees fast and low. Its prey rarely sees it. The feather will be kept for a time and then forgotten. Dogs move around the settlement at dusk. They are not the breeds that come later. They are smaller, lean, with rough coats, closer to their working origins. They are not pets in any modern sense. They work, they hunt, they guard, they alert the settlement when something approaches at night. In return, they are fed scraps. They sleep near the entrance to the roundhouse, where the warmth leaks out through the gap beneath the door. The light now is the particular grey-blue of a Scottish late summer evening. The sky above the tree line still holds some colour. Lower down, among the trees, it is already dark. The birches at the forest edge are the last to lose their pale outline. They stand like a boundary between the known and the unknown ground. The sounds change at dusk. Through the day there has been the irregular noise of work, wood being cut, stone being struck against stone, a child calling out, the thud of a tool into soil. Now those sounds stop. What remains is the river, constant, below the bank. An owl beginning somewhere in the oaks. The small adjustments of the thatch, above as the temperature drops and the timber contracts. The cattle are brought in before dark. They are small, dark-coated, the cattle of this period in northern Britain. They have spent the day on the rough ground above the settlement, watched by a boy of perhaps 10 years. He brings them back along a worn path through the bracken. They know the path. They do not need much directing. The cattle do not sleep inside the roundhouse in summer. There is a separate enclosure for them, a timber-fenced pen built against the outer wall of the largest house. They settle quickly. Their warmth adds to the warmth of the wall beside them. In winter, the arrangement would change. The stone circles are not far from this settlement. There are 3 of them within a day's walk, all built long before these people were born. The largest is perhaps 4,000 years old. The stones were raised in the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age by people whose language, customs, and daily life were different in almost every detail from the people here in 83 AD. But the stones are still there. They have always been there, as far as anyone in this settlement knows. The circles are not ignored. They are not treated as simple curiosities. The people of this settlement know which ones face the midsummer sunrise. They know which ones align with the midwinter sunset. This knowledge is useful in a year without written calendars. The circles are a kind of clock, a marker of the turning year, maintained not by upkeep but by presence. Some of the stones in the nearest circle have fallen. One leans at a steep angle, its base no longer fully buried. A crack runs through the upper section of the tallest standing stone, put there by frost over many winters. The grass around the bases of the stones is short and thick, grazed by sheep that wander through the open ground around them. The sheep do not know the stones have any significance. They simply find the area open and the grass acceptable. The tribe occupying this region of Caledonia is most likely one of those later described by Roman writers as part of the broadly named Caledonian peoples. By 83 AD, the Roman general Gnaeus Julius Agricola has pushed his campaign into the north of Britain. His legions have been in Britain since 43 AD, but only now is the Roman presence pressing into the land north of the Forth. The Battle of Mons Graupius, wherever exactly it occurred, is likely no more than a year away from this evening. The people at this settlement know that soldiers have come from the south. The knowledge has traveled without writing, carried by traders, by people who have fled, by hunters who have seen the camps and the standards, and the lines of men moving in formation along ground that had never before seen anything like it. The information is not abstract. It describes things the community has never encountered and can only partly picture. Tonight, this evening, none of that is immediate. The fire is the immediate thing. The broth is the immediate thing. The cattle are settled. The children are coming indoors. The dogs are moving to their places by the door. The fire in the central hearth is built up slightly for the evening. The peat is laid in carefully, not thrown. A single piece of wood, a split length of dried oak, is placed across the peat at an angle. The fire does not need to be large. It needs to last through the night and be coaxable back to life in the morning. The light inside the roundhouse is low. The fire gives the primary light, supplemented by a small clay lamp burning animal fat with a wick of twisted plant fiber. The lamp sits in a natural hollow of the stone beside the hearth. It gives off a steady, small flame. It smells of the fat it burns, which is mutton tallow tonight. Conversation in the evening is not recorded anywhere. No one has written it down, but the sounds of it are easy to place. Low voices, the particular murmur of people who have been together all day and are winding down, not needing to explain much, talking in the shorthand of people who know each other's daily rhythms. An elder sits closest to the fire. She has been grinding grain earlier in the day and now sits with her hands rested in her lap. She is perhaps 50 years old, which is a significant age in this period. Her knowledge is the community's memory. She holds the names of places, the timing of the year, the sequence of tasks that keeps the settlement fed and warm. None of it is written, all of it is hers. The broth is ready. It is ladled into the wooden bowls with a carved wooden implement, a deep spoon worn thin on one side from years of use. The bread is broken rather than cut and passed from hand to hand. Eating is not ceremonious. It is quiet and ordinary, the way eating is at the end of a long physical day when the body simply needs to stop and be fed. Outside, the last of the color has left the sky. The hill to the west is now only a shape against a slightly lighter darkness. The river continues below the bank, moving northeast toward the wider water beyond the forest. A fish turns somewhere in the black water of the pool below the bend, catching something just beneath the surface, and the forests run unbroken from the firths to the high ground. In the year 83 AD, there are no roads through most of this land. There are tracks worn into the earth by feet and hooves over many generations. The trees press close on either side. Oak and ash and birch stand thick across the lower slopes. Above the tree line, the open moorland begins, pale and silent under a sky full of stars. The night air is cold, even in late summer. At this latitude, the warmth leaves quickly once the sun drops. A man standing outside his roundhouse in the hills above the Tay Valley would feel the chill settle into his shoulders within minutes of the fire dying down. He would pull his woolen cloak tighter. He would look out across the valley and see almost nothing. There are no lights on the horizon, no distant glow from any town. The settlements of the Caledonia are small, scattered, and dark by nightfall. A roundhouse with its door sealed against the cold gives off no visible light. The fire inside is banked low, breathing slowly under a covering of turf. The smoke rises through the thatched roof and disappears into the dark above. From a distance, you would not know the place was inhabited at all. The roundhouses themselves are substantial structures. The walls are built from timber uprights packed with wattle and daub, or in some places from dry stone laid carefully without mortar. The roofs are steeply pitched and thatched with heather or rushes cut from the lower ground near the locks. A well-maintained roof sheds water efficiently and holds the warmth of the fire below. The largest roundhouses in a settlement might measure 12 or 15 meters across the interior. A family sleeps, eats, works, and shelters their animals in that single circular space. Inside, the fire occupies the center of the floor. It sits in a shallow depression in the earth, ringed with flat stones to contain the embers. The smoke has no chimney to travel through. It rises slowly toward the apex of the roof and filters out through the thatch. The interior is permanently smoked. The timbers of the roof are dark and resinous from years of exposure. Meat and fish hung near the rafters cure slowly in that smoke. By late summer, there would be haunches of venison up there and dried salmon taken from the river before the big autumn runs began. The cattle are brought inside at night. They stand in a pennied area near the wall, separated from the sleeping area by a low timber partition. Their warmth adds to the warmth of the fire. Their smell is permanent, absorbed into the walls and the bedding. The bedding is bracken and dried grass laid thickly on the earthen floor. It is renewed when it becomes too foul to sleep on comfortably. In high summer, that might be every few weeks. In winter, the turnover slows because the bracken is harder to gather. Dogs sleep near the fire. The dogs kept by the Caledonii are working animals. They are used for hunting, for herding, and for warning. A good dog sleeping near the door will raise its head at any sound from outside. It will not bark unnecessarily. It has learned the difference between the sound of a deer moving through the undergrowth 30 meters away and the sound of something larger approaching the settlement perimeter. Tonight it hears only the ordinary sounds of the forest. The forest sounds after dark are steady and layered. Tawny owls call across the valley. They have been calling from these same tree lines for thousands of years. Their calls are not dramatic. They are part of the background, like the sound of the burn running over stones below the settlement. The burn runs all night. It does not stop. The water coming off the high ground never stops moving. In late summer, it is lower than it will be in autumn, but it still makes its constant sound over the flat rocks at the ford. Red deer move through the lower forest edges after dark. In 83 AD, the deer population across Caledonia is dense. They have the entire northern half of the island largely to themselves. A herd of 20 or 30 animals might move along the valley floor during the night hours, stepping carefully, pausing to listen, moving on again. They avoid the settlements. They know the smell of dogs and fire and humans. They keep their distance, passing 100 meters upwind of the nearest roundhouse without making a sound that would carry to the dogs inside. Wolves are present. They have been present in this landscape since the last glaciation. By 83 AD, the wolf population across northern Britain is still substantial. Packs range across the higher ground and through the deep forest. They do not often trouble a settlement directly. They have learned that settlements mean dogs and fire and men with spears. But their howling carries across the valleys at night, sometimes close, sometimes from a distance that is hard to judge in the dark. A child waking in the roundhouse and hearing that sound would be hushed back to sleep by an adult who had heard it 1,000 times. Wild boar root through the undergrowth of the oakwood below the settlement. They are heavy animals, and they move noisily when they are not alarmed. The sound of a boar working through fallen leaves and soft earth is a deep, rhythmic rooting sound. It carries further than you might expect on a still night. The boar have been feeding since late afternoon, taking advantage of the mast falling from the oak trees. In a good mast year, the boar grow fat by late autumn. The Caledonii know this, and the autumn hunt for boar is a serious undertaking. The sky above the valley is extraordinary by any measure available to us now. In 83 AD, there is no source of artificial light across the entire landscape. The Milky Way is fully visible on clear nights. It runs from horizon to horizon in a dense, unbroken band. The stars that a farmer or warrior or child looked up at from this valley were the same stars that are there now, but they could actually see them all, every one. The sky was not a pale suggestion of stars. It was a solid mass of them, textured and layered. The moon on this particular night in late summer is in its last quarter. It rises late. For most of the dark hours, the valley is lit only by starlight. That is enough to see the pale shape of the birch trees at the forest edge. It is enough to see the outline of a roundhouse roof against the sky. It is not enough to see the path between the houses without knowing it well. The settlement is built by people who know every step of it by feel if necessary. The watches at night in a Caledonian settlement are not formalized in the way that a Roman garrison would organize them. There is no written record of assigned watch periods, but there is evidence from later accounts and from the structure of hill forts that settlements were not left entirely unguarded. An older man or a young one not yet sleeping would sit near the door, tending the fire, listening. The fire inside needs attention through the night to survive until morning. Someone wakes in the small hours to feed it. That moment of waking is also a moment of listening. The hill fort settlements of this region sit on elevated ground for good reason. The hill forts of Tayside and Angus occupy ridges and summits from which the approaches can be seen clearly in daylight. After dark, the advantage shifts from sight to hearing. Sound carries well in still air across open upland. The creak of a timber palisade settling in the cold, the movement of animals in the pen, the burn below, the wind, if there is wind, moving through the heather on the upper slopes. These sounds are all known. Any sound that does not belong to them is noticed. The palisade walls of the larger hill forts are built from split timber. The uprights are set into the earth and packed tightly together. On the inside, A walkway of timber planking runs along the top of the wall, wide enough for a man to stand on. In the dark, a man standing on that walkway looks out over the valley below. He can see the pale thread of the river. He can see the tree canopy as a darker mass against the sky. He cannot see much beyond 100 meters. He listens instead. The river below the hill-fort settlements of this region is the Tay, or one of its tributaries flowing down from the Grampian foothills. The Tay in 83 AD runs through a landscape that is wetter and more heavily wooded than it is today. The flood plain is marshy in places. Alder trees grow thickly along the banks. The river itself is wide and clear and full of salmon. The salmon runs in late summer and autumn are enormous by any standard we can imagine now. The water churns with them on the right days. But at night in late summer, the river runs quietly, and the salmon are not yet running in their greatest numbers. Boats are pulled up onto the bank at night. The boats used on the Tay and its tributaries at this period are coracles and small dugout craft. A coracle is made from a wicker frame covered with animal hide. It is light enough for one man to carry on his back. It is used for fishing, for crossing the river, for moving small loads along the bank. At night, the coracle sits upturned on the bank above the waterline. It does not look like much. It is an entirely functional object. The hide covering will last 2 or 3 seasons before it needs replacing. The food eaten in a Caledonian settlement in 83 AD is varied, and it is not the starvation diet that people sometimes assume for this period. The evidence from excavated sites across Scotland shows grain, animal bone, fish bone, and the remains of gathered plants. Barley is the primary grain. It is ground between 2 stones, the upper stone rotated by hand. The flour is coarse. It is used to make flatbreads baked on a stone beside the fire, and a thick porridge that is the most common daily food. The porridge is made with water or milk. It is eaten from a wooden bowl. It keeps a person warm and working. Cattle are the measure of wealth in this society. A large herd means status and security. Cattle provide milk through the summer months and leather and bone throughout the year. They are slaughtered selectively in autumn when the grass stops growing and there is not enough fodder to carry all of them through winter. The meat from autumn slaughter is preserved by smoking and by salting if salt is available from coastal communities. Salt is a trade good. It moves inland from the coast along the same tracks that everything else moves along. The clothing worn by the people of Caledonian settlements is woven from wool. The sheep kept in this period produce a coarser fleece than modern breeds. The fabric woven from it is dense and hard-wearing, not fine. It is dyed with plant materials. Weld gives yellow, woad gives blue. Plants from the moorland give a range of browns and rusts. A woman's dress is a long woolen garment belted at the waist. A man's clothing is a tunic and trousers with a rectangular woolen cloak pinned at the shoulder with an iron or bronze brooch. The brooch is sometimes the most valuable object a person owns. Iron is worked at larger settlements. The evidence for iron smelting in Iron Age Scotland comes from the slag found at excavated sites. The iron ore is smelted in a small clay furnace using bellows to force air through the fire. The resulting bloom of iron is hammered on an anvil stone. The smith makes tools, knives, spear points, sickle blades, ox goads, pins. The sound of the smithy is a daytime sound. At night, the forge is cold. The tools made that day hang on a timber peg or lie wrapped in oiled cloth. The stone circles that stand on the lower ground and on the moor edges above the settlements are older than anyone in this valley can account for. In 83 AD, the Great Circle at Callanish on the Isle of Lewis has already been standing for more than 2,000 years. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire are similarly ancient. The people living near them do not build them and do not know who did. They are simply part of the landscape. They are aligned with the movements of the sun and the moon in ways that suggest their builders tracked the sky very carefully. At night, the stones stand in